eventful. We certainly had some great presentations and hours. So thank you to Laura for getting that done for us. We are now moving in. So I'm going to go ahead, Kyle, I guess. And do we need to start?
And we are live.
Here?
Yep,
we are live.
good.
Okay, great. All right. Then I am now going to turn it to Regent Shower and have her walk us through the Finance and Compliance Committee agenda with us.
Thank you, Chair Dickinson. Welcome. This is a committee of the whole, and we have a lot to cover. I'm pretty excited about some of the presentations today because they are forward facing and foreshadowing some of the other work that we'll do later this year, but ensuring that we're all thinking about what's ahead. So with that, one of the areas that we've committed to, even if there isn't necessarily something to provide an update about, we have made a commitment to ensure that we are talking about the athletics budget at each of these meetings. And so I would welcome Vice President for Finance and Administration and CFO Stacy Pearson to provide an update on the athletics budget. So with that, Stacy.
Great. Hello again, everybody. Good afternoon. As Regent Shower indicated, we are committed to bringing an update on the athletics budget to each of our Regents meeting. And of course, January, this being our first new January meeting as a full Regents meeting, we don't have a lot of additional information to report on athletics budget from the November meeting for a couple of reasons. And one is, of course, the big events are getting through football season and kind of seeing where the changes are there. I will note that we did see an uptick from our budget, our FY22 budget on ticket revenue, but we will be able to report to you at a later meeting, March and May, for our audited financial statements. We will have completely closed out and have the audited results for FY21 athletics budget, and then we'll have an update on the FY22 budget that reflects the kind of the outcome of the fall 21 football season. So that's why it's in here, as making sure that we agree, we agreed that we would provide that, even though there's not a lot of additional information, but giving you an indication that there's more to come in the next two meetings.
Are there any questions about what was in your packet or any other information that you need on this topic? Okay, hearing none. Next up on our agenda is the WSU budget model project update. Excited to have both our provost and Pullman chancellor, Elizabeth Chilton, and then Stacy to present this budget model update.
Thank you very much, Regent Shower. So Stacy and I will go through a very short PowerPoint, which is in your packet, but put a little flesh on the bones here, and then open it up for questions. This is really intended to be an update of where we've gotten so far. So we do not have a proposal per se ready for you, but we will be moving towards something that we will be proposing certainly to Kirk, and we'll share with the Regents at a later date when we get a little further along. So if you can go to the next slide, Kyle. When I was being hired, actually back in April of 2020, one of the items on the list for the new provost to undertake would be to be involved in exploring a new budget model for WSU. And to be honest, it was one of the things that really attracted me to this position, the opportunity to work with Stacy and colleagues across the system on this. Really, we were charged, we got to work in earnest in the fall of 2020. And I'll show you in a minute the committee members really representing all units across the system and all campuses. But we were charged with engaging the system community and really understanding our current budget practices, both in terms of how we allocate university resources and how we assess costs. We were charged with looking at national best practices and comparing ourselves to them and seeing whether or not our current practices were really meeting the needs and the strategic priorities of WSU, and then proposing specific changes. We also were charged with exploring a more holistic budget model that might be able to help incentivize some of the things we want to do, and informing us with data that helps us meet those priorities. So even though we're called the Executive Budget Council, I really think of this as the Strategic Budget Council in terms of, I think our underlying question is, how do we tie our resource allocation and cost allocation to our strategic plan as a system? How do we amass the resources to make sure that we're making good on our strategy? That's really, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do. So next slide, please. Just to quickly show you the names of all of the people who are currently serving on the Executive Budget Council. This list is the group of people that Stacy and I meet with most often. We've also been engaging with Huron Consulting, who has been helping guide us through this process over the past year and a bit. But with the Executive Budget Council and Huron Consulting has also worked with Stacy and I to meet with chancellors individually, deans individually, area finance officers, a number of people from the budget office itself. So they've been engaging really across the system, even though this committee is charged in the end with making any explicit recommendations. So next slide, please. So I will not read the slide to you, but just to give you a sense of where we started. The first thing we started with was, what are our values as we go into both assessing our current budget practices and maybe proposing some changes either to our practices or to a budget model. And these were some of the things that the Executive Budget Council came up with, partly through engaging with all of the other constituencies that I mentioned. We want, obviously, leaders want a predictable basis for planning and introducing new programs. Just as one tiny example, right now, it's very difficult if I was a dean or a department chair to really assess if I wanted to create a new degree program, for example, to be able to understand really clearly and transparently what would the revenue implications be. What would the new revenues that might come in and what would be the costs associated with those revenues? Not that I would make a decision about whether to create a new degree program completely on the bottom line, but I would want to make sure that I understood what the revenue and cost implications were. And currently, right now, that is very difficult to do because we don't have one clear budget model that is consistent across the system. So increasing transparency, aligning resource allocation with accountability and responsibility, and incentivizing growth. You'll see here too that we talked about really a deep commitment to inclusiveness throughout this process, to supporting our strategic plan, which includes a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, as we were talking about earlier today. So let me move on to the next slide. So really important to any changes to our budget model, there was a consistent desire for an all funds approach. It's very common in higher education to treat different kinds of funds that come into the university as if they're different colors of money. Tuition is maybe allocated one way, state appropriation might be allocated another way. Direct costs obviously go to where the grant sponsor has asked them to go to, but sometimes indirect costs are also then parsed out a different way. And of course, gifts, especially unrestricted gifts, might be allocated out another way completely. So one of the things that we wanted to explore was what an all funds budgeting would look like, because this will aid in that transparency and aid in planning for deans, directors, vice presidents, chancellors across the system. If you have a sense of what are all the unrestricted funds, funds that are not given for a very specific purpose, what are all the funds you have at your disposal? And then I'll talk in a little bit about costs, how you get a sense of all of the costs associated as well. So next slide, please. So as we looked nationally at sort of, best practices and also things that haven't worked at some of our peer institutions, we sort of looked at what the most common models are and what our current model is, and historically where other universities have made changes. We currently have an incremental budget model. The easiest way to explain this is to say that your best predictor as a provost, a vice president, a dean, or a department chair or chancellor, the best way to predict next year's budget is based on what this year's budget is, plus or minus an increment. But it doesn't tend to change very quickly, and it doesn't change responsively to changes in activity. So for example, if I'm the dean of college X and next year my enrollments drop suddenly or raise suddenly, there is no automatic increase or decrease in my budget in an academic unit. And so in general, it's up to deans, presidents, provosts, et cetera, to take a look at budgets and adjust them over time, but it tends to sort of lag behind some of those behaviors. So we looked at lots of different budget models, some that are more centralized, some that are more decentralized. And we've started to focus on examining a possibility of what's called a responsibility-centered budgeting. Responsibility-centered budgeting, sometimes called RCM or responsibility-centered management, responsible-centered management, really focuses on allocating out resources, unrestricted resources, to the units where they're generated. In this case, that would be campuses and then colleges, and then allocating costs to those units based on their use of centralized funds. And this way, changes in activity would potentially result more quickly, although not with drastic jerks to the system, because what we're looking at is a model where that we would maintain a central steering wheel to make sure that we're maintaining those commitments to central strategic priorities, to equity, or making sure we're ensuring quality across the system. So it isn't as decentralized as what some people call an every tub on its own bottom, where there's complete decentralization and it's sort of every college for itself. And that has been implemented at a few institutions across the country with some really dire outcomes. Probably, I would say over the past 20 years, though, very, very few institutions have gone as far as completely decentralized, and they've focused more on this responsibility-centered budgeting. So next slide, please. So we've been looking at what we're calling a customized responsibility-centered management or responsibility-centered budgeting. We're looking at, as I said, a higher degree of central authority or oversight to make sure we're meeting system-wide priorities, and we're allocating revenues out based on activity, and then looking at a kind of tax back rate based on usage of central services that are shared by all. So you're not creating services at each one of our campuses or in each one of our colleges, but you're really trying to pool some of those central services to be maximally efficient. So next slide, please. Okay, so the basic elements, what we decided to do is to model what WSU would have looked like in fiscal year 2020 if we had had, instead of an incremental budget, if we had had a responsibility-centered budget. We asked Huron to model us, and I will say, and Stacy, when we get to your part of the presentation, perhaps you can say how much work your team has put into this. On top of Workday transition, your team has really been helping them populate the model with a look in the mirror. What would we have looked like in that scenario? And the way they've built the model is that they allocate revenue out to campuses and to colleges based on their portion, if you will, of tuition and fee revenues based on student credit hours and major head count. There's also a research subvention based on proportion of research expenditures, because we're also trying to incentivize strong research. We're a Research One university. And so our teaching and our research are at the core of our mission. And then they, in the model, have allocated out costs to those units, both their direct costs of their faculties and staff, but also costs of the central services, as I said, the libraries, IT, buildings and grounds, etc. When you do that, you end up with some schools and colleges that end up with a negative unit margin, and some campuses that end up with a positive unit margin and others negative. And this is to be expected. And I have engaged in a modeling exercise like this at previous institutions. The cost of instruction for example, engineering is higher typically than in the humanities. And so you end up seeing differential unit margins, and that's not an assessment of value, but it's an expression of the reality of the costs of doing what we do. And so oftentimes then there's a central pool for subvention to sort of hold harmless, to recognize that there needs to be subvention of certain units. But then as you move the model forward, the idea is that hopefully you encourage those unit margins to, certainly negative margins, to not get bigger, and hopefully positive unit margins to be spent in ways that benefit the whole and not just individual responsibility centers. So next slide, please. So this is our last slide. This is where Stacy takes over and brings it all home as the quickest version of responsibility-centered budgeting I've ever described. And I know there's a lot of detail here. And I'll turn it over to Stacy to say what our next steps are right now. They're building the model, but I'll let Stacy sort of let you know what comes next.
Sure. And Kyle, if you would go back a slide, the thing I want to emphasize, I really appreciate Elizabeth's experience in this, because I too have some past experience in budget models, and it's been very interesting to compare what she did at another institution and we did, and how we can fit it into at WSU. Because the big challenge at WSU that I hadn't seen before is we have campuses with colleges and campuses without colleges. And so getting to that point, as well as it's been really important to kind of, really look into how we were doing this, because that transition from what we were doing before and being able to explain that. See, this is the key when you're working with deans and with your other area leaders. They're like, hey, what happened here? You're taking money away. And I remind them, but budget models don't give new money. It's an allocation process. The other thing I would note is there is usually a disconnection of the costs. And that's what's really important with us working with this model, is considering those costs and then just acknowledging that there's some deficits that will have to be remedied in the future. So part of that is to be able to explain it well, see where it comes from, and agree to, where we want to get, with the understanding that most of these models get tweaked as you go, because you start understanding things, that may have happened in the past that the model didn't take into account. So go ahead to the last slide here. So we have gotten to the point of working through the general methodology. And like I said, this was a pretty extensive process and done at the same time, or really literally shortly after going live with Workday, and, trying to pull the FY20 revenues from the old system and then having the new system and all of that. But we also felt that it was really important to do this now that we were going to have better data and all of this, that this was a good time, as well as the transition to the system. So working through the revenues, assessing the costs, and identifying, discussing, defining a subvention process. Where the Huron team has been meeting with the deans, the chancellors, and the area finance officers, that's what the AFOs are, to validate data and create the general framework for the system and campus level budget modeling. So you can imagine people get their data, they say, wait, where did this come from? This doesn't look like what we thought it was. So it's pretty intensive to go through each of those areas, as well as touch bases back with myself and my staff to say, and even we have questions, wait a minute, I'm not sure where this came from. So important to do this work now that we all understand the what is, so that we can effectively transfer, to what we want the budget model to do. Then we put early this year, January of 2022, we have that general model for the system level with the 2020 actuals. And as all of you know, 2021 was an odd year with COVID. So now we're going to be needing to put in, as we go forward, the 2021 information, recognizing that, we're just in a period where, things have been a little bit different, but still the model should be able to help us with that even going forward. So we continue to update it based on the stakeholder feedback. And again, really trying to answer questions. We're not trying to go through this and say, oh, I'm sorry, you don't understand. You'll understand in the end. And that means that it's very, labor intensive to have those reviews and those discussions, but we do think it will pay off in the long run. And then very importantly, focusing on governance for decisions that are informed by the data in this model, because it's going to look different. It just is. And how do we want to manage that? In other words, one key part of this model is a strategic investment fund. So how is that funded? And importantly, a governance decision. How do we decide what is used for? Because that's where we can take on new investments that are strategic in nature. For example, maybe some of that is that marketing and communications plan that you saw earlier. Those are the types of things that you can get addressed in that. So we do hope to implement our shadow system form in July 2022, which is the first month of our new fiscal year FY23. And I think what we have found in the past, as well as in discussion with our consultants, is very helpful to kind of run it as a shadow system, kind of the what is in your current budget as the what would it look like in this new budget model. And it helps with that transition if you have a year where you're seeing that difference and what is driving it. So that's really where we are. And so we're very excited that we've gotten this far, even though that time has passed pretty quickly. I'm surprised to find us already well over a year into working on this. So, but now we are seeing numbers. And so this is a big part of the process. So I hope that explains kind of what we're up to, and let us know if you have questions.
Thank you, Stacy. I suspect Regent Redmond might have a question.
Saw me go off mute.
I did, right at that same time.
Good giveaway, yeah. So thank you for the presentation. I think this represents some substantial progress. I had sort of one strategic question as I was reading through the materials. So hypothetically, under this new system, in sort of your wildest dreams, how much money could move from one endeavor to another endeavor in a given budget cycle? Because what I see here is a lot of accountability and a lot of, transparency and empowering of people to have their fingers on the knobs, because, things are going to be so well attributed in terms of costs and revenues, and so therefore, and that's definitely an improvement than sort of the I'm just going to spend until somebody tells me to stop kind of system that often pops up in the absence of another system. But I still feel like this approach might not do the thing that I hope for us, and I think is going to be necessary in higher ed over the next decade or so, which is to make really big moves where we stop doing some things and start doing some things in a less than incremental way, or in a more than incremental way, I should say.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to ask the question of, sort of under this system, how radical a move could we make in any one year?
What I will say, I think it's a great question. I think that, the budget model is a way to inform those decisions and to have those tough conversations and to have everyone looking at the exact same information. And it really will shine a light when you see enrollment differences, declines, growth, And when you see what the costs are that are associated with that growth, right? I mean, in general, in universities, we tend to focus on the revenue. We don't really focus on the costs. Those are sort of invisible. If we build this program, it's going to bring in all this tuition and we're going to hire lots of faculty and it's going to be wonderful. And we all hope that that happens, but sometimes we don't predict or assess the costs well enough in advance. And then we end up short and having to take it from somewhere else that it might not have been the most strategic decision. It is not a formula-based budgeting. It is not a push a green button and whatever comes out the other end, that's your college's budget or your campus's budget. But it does provide that base model that then ultimately, Stacy and I are thinking we might have a strategic budget committee that sort of looks at the end of annual budget hearings, makes a recommendation to Kirk at the end of the budget hearing process. But in the end, it will enable those kinds of larger scale decisions that will be informed by data. Right now, we really don't have the data that are sufficient to inform those kinds of decisions well. And this will inform those decisions. But it's important that it doesn't take the decision makers out of the loop, but provides a level of transparency and accountability. So if Kirk said, okay, I don't like anthropology anymore, he would have the data there to support that, and he would need to be able to be accountable for making a decision like that, but everyone would be looking at the same data.
Heather, I guess I would answer it within several years. I would like us to be in a position that we could put somewhere between $2.5 to $4 million towards something almost immediately, because we would have that money set aside in some strategic funds. Now, that might mean that we elect to not do several other things, but not going out and taxing everybody and that kind of stuff, which is the way we've worked in the past. Those are the kind of dollar figures I think it's realistic for us to get to. If you say, well, what about a $25 million idea? How quickly could you respond to that? I don't think it's going to be, I don't believe in the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to be able to pivot that amount of money that quickly. But I do think we need to be in the position that we could do several million, with a week or two's notice.
And I would just add, there's a lot of drivers there. For instance, you heard us say subvention, and that we would have a year of hold harmless. Well, how long will you do that? If the less time you spend in hold harmless mode might mean that then you have some of those additional funds, more quickly to be able to allocate. And the point that Elizabeth makes about having the data, which is a lot of what Chris Hoyt and her group is working on, is really measuring where are our most productive courses or programs, those types of things. And then, what do we want to do about that? It also means that you look at some that are less productive. Maybe enrollments are declining in them, so that you look at those and assess, well, is this really core to our mission, and does it need investment to make it better? Or is it just something that people are not subscribing to? So we need to consider that it would be closed down and then taking those actions. That's where you then get reallocation, where more of the money can come into either that strategic, most likely into that strategic fund.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's partly just me having a hard time translating this from, the corporate realm where most of us spend a lot of our time, and just thinking about, you're always looking at what is the higher purpose, I would say higher margin, but what is the higher purpose in our case in terms of fulfilling our goals versus what we're doing today? And then what do we have to stop doing in order to fund the thing that is more congruent with our land grant mission? And that, what I hear is, we will, over time, money will shift to less productive programs from those to more productive programs, but we don't have a lot of capability to sort of say, okay, what we can see in the state of Washington is that there needs to be, a massive funding of, carbon sequestration in soils, thing. And we're going to stand up a whole new college in that area. And that means we got to stop doing this over there. And so it's just, we're still, we're not going to be able to be as nimble as I think ideally we would be in this coming age, based on this process. And because we'll always be trying to squirrel away some investment dollars, but it'll never be enough to really, do say 3 strategic things at once, for example, because we won't have that sort of strategic money set aside in a way that we can invest it, because we haven't taken money from another place. Because it's not like the revenue's growing, across the board. It's not. So I guess that's just my concern, and that may just be the nature of the academic beast, and there's just no way around it. But I would love to know whether there's a more radical approach to running a university than what this model would suggest.
So Heather, one thing I will mention is, I would say this, if we implement a budget model like this, it will be extremely radical for WSU. We've been operating in an incremental budget model since the 19th century, as most land grant universities do. About 50% of the universities in this country have moved sort of more towards the kind of model we're talking about. It builds an explicit strategic investment pool, which we do not have right now. That isn't to say that we don't make strategic central investments. The cluster hire that we talked about this morning is an example of that. And, Stacy and Kirk and I scrounged around and found the funds to do that. But a lot of the strategic investments we make are Stacy's long list of what she calls her unfunded commitments we've made, but we don't have an identified pool of money, and we sort of try to figure out how we fund it. This would set up a transparent process for that strategic investment pool, build the fund, and also have it be out in the light. What are the things that WSU is going to make as strategic investments this year, next year, moving forward? So that's why I do think it is relatively radical. The other thing about universities, when I was a college dean, 93% of my operating budget was faculty and staff salaries, 93%. And I bet that that's pretty typical of most of our schools and colleges and campuses. That's one of the reasons why, universities typically do not say, we're going to suddenly stand up this new college next year, because it would mean you only have 7% of your budget or so, and that's probably running your photocopiers. And so without a lot of new money, it's difficult to switch that radically on the dime, but I do think that building a strategic investment pool will be fairly radical for WSU.
But also point out that we also want to look at other sources of revenue to do investments and things, including upping our game in philanthropy. So that's not the solution to everything, but to me, it's coupling it with multiple things that allow us to pivot when we need to.
Regent Sims.
When I was in college, I was a radical student. I had a big fro, beard, and did all kinds of change. But it's always important to have there's going to be ideas like the ones you're suggesting that are actually going to be seen as pretty radical. How do you walk people to the goal so that they don't fear the process?
It's a really, really great question. I could say that I certainly encountered that in the past when we were trying to implement something similar. What's interesting, and Stacy and I have talked about this a lot, as we have gone around and talked to people, if everyone was very happy with our current budget model and process, it would be much harder to say, we need this change. But I think in general, there's a strong sense of discontent. When we set up our campuses outside of Pullman, we did so organically. And I dare say each one of our campuses has a slightly different budget model that underlies it. And several of our colleges, even on one campus, have different budget models. And so when deans try to get together to work out a joint degree, for example, they've got apples and oranges that they're playing with, and it can be really frustrating. And so we have dozens and dozens of MOUs between chancellors and deans about how they're going to share revenue, et cetera. Really complicated and not transparent at all. And so I think there is a hunger for deans, for chairs, for chancellors, for all of us vice presidents to have a better way to do long-term planning. We all want to do it. We want to make those radical changes that Heather's talking about, but we don't know how to plan for that because we've got 1 year at a time incremental budget. And so it's almost like, I'm not a financial analyst, but it's almost like the difference between just balancing your checkbook at the end of every month and really doing long-term financial planning. And this kind of a tool, I really do believe, will allow us to do more of that long-term planning that will help us really move the ship faster. But you're right, that is going to be the biggest challenge, Ron. You put your finger right on it, which is that, this is a pretty radical change. And so it can be scary. So the socialization part of this, the hold harmless, the shadow system for a year, making sure there aren't any major jerks to the system, they're going to be really critical.
Thank you.
Ron, I might also point out, we've got to over communicate. And when we talk about over communication, sending people a 50 slide deck and saying, hey, we're communicating about all this stuff. We got really smart faculty, staff, and students across the system, but they don't think about this stuff all the time. Elizabeth and Stacy are really down in the weeds. It's important that we communicate out frequently in translatable type of information so that smart people can go and give it 10, 15 minutes and go, okay, I got it. I understand generally what they're doing and why, and I'm for it. And I just think that is number one. Two, we have to have a timeline that we use, and they put that in place, and we got to stick to that. And that's what sometimes happens is we love to talk in higher ed. Sometimes we don't. We'll spend so much time discussing it. At some point, you got to sort of pull the trigger. And I think having a timeline, I found faculty and staff and students, if they understand, okay, this is happening over 2 years, here's a timeline, here are the decision points, that we can manage change effectively within higher ed. And I've talked to a lot of our folks outside the university about change within higher ed generally, and said, hold us accountable to do the change, but don't try and dictate the process by how we do it internally. And nobody here is trying to do that, but that's our job, I think, is how do we manage within our environment this kind of change? And as a board, you all need to say, we expect you to do that change. It may be different than we would do organizationally, but we don't expect you to sit and not do it. So I think we've got a reasonable plan, and we may have to hit pause at some point for a couple months on something if there's some issues, and we gotta be willing to do that, but just not stop. That's really the key thing.
Shane,
So, sorry. I was just going to call on Regent Wright.
Thanks. I had two questions. One was, I noticed on the committee that most of the campuses were represented, but the Everett campus and the Vancouver campus, it didn't look like they had a representation, and maybe I missed them. And I know you said you also worked with the chancellors and had these different meetings, but if you could talk a little bit more about the committee, I'd be curious to hear about that. And then secondly, and maybe this is for a future conversation, but one thing I'm curious to learn more about would be the implications on our student organizations, like our student government and our S&A fees. And so if you could even just touch on that briefly, recognizing that that's one piece of this huge puzzle and there's a lot to sort out. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you for this work, and that I particularly am excited about the shadow work and looking back and applying backwards. I think that's going to be a great tool and an asset for helping everyone across the system move through this and through that work that Regent Sims was touching on. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Regent Wright. What I will say is that we don't have every dean represented. We don't have every chancellor represented. but what we did is tried to have a diverse group, including the AFO from Vancouver, for example, the chancellor from Tri-Cities. And as I said, we're having dedicated sessions individually with chancellors. Once we have the full model built out, we're going to meet with each individual chancellor, and the AFOs have also been working with us really closely, both for the campuses and for the colleges. I will say, just as a factoid, Everett's is the only campus currently that does not have a separate budget from the Pullman campus. It's actually part of the overall Pullman budget. That's something that we would all like to change, and this budget model will help us do that, make a distinct budget for the Everett campus for both revenues and for costs. And so the campus and system engagement this spring is going to be really critical to President Schultz's point, which is that now we need to get it out there. We need to get the feedback. Now that we've sort of built the model, the Executive Budget Council will make recommendations on the model. They will not make recommendations on allocations of revenues to particular units, right? It's about the process that they're making the recommendations, not the outcome. And it's building that governance structure for the long term that will help govern how we make those decisions, how we inform those decisions, and who's held accountable. That's really where that goes to. Stacy, would you talk about the fees piece, because we addressed that separately?
Yes, but actually I'll also, the Vice Chancellor for Finance from the Vancouver campus was a member, and when she transitioned out, her replacement has just come in. So I wanted to make that point, that we should have added her name, but at the time we were putting these slides together, we hadn't identified her at that point in time. And then, so your other question, Regent Wright, on the activity fees, that is a separate process that's outside of this. Reason being is those fees are dedicated to each of those campuses where the students determine how they want to spend those. So it is a separate process outside of this, and this allocation isn't also allocating those fees because of the nature of those.
Thank you both.
I wanted to make a comment, and we need to move on to a couple other items on our agenda. But before I do that, I just wanted to see, were there any other questions that Regents may have regarding the budget model?
Yeah, Regent Shower, this is Jen. So thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate the enormous investment of your time and creativity and making sure that the one WSU pulls through the enterprise transformation process. And I guess as I listen to the conversation, I think there's also an opportunity to just strengthen the positive opportunity that comes from innovation and growth out of this, and kind of linking it back to the one WSU strategy, the efficient use of resources, the capital allocation to innovation. There's a different frame of mind when you kind of think about the potential for innovation and the positive communication that can come from this. So I just wanted to reflect on that, and possibly through the communication process as you go through this and you explain the why to people, you know, you might want to think about that linkage and tone, because I think it's exciting, but it's a big undertaking, and I applaud you all, President Schultz and the entire team. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Ramos.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? One of the comments that I heard mentioned a couple of times was this concept of shadow. And I wanted to link back to a presentation that we had at our last Board of Regents meeting. We had a presentation around equity, which feels appropriate because we had some strategic time this morning around equity. And OB for the third's presentation as it relates to systemic racism and institutional discrimination around budget models. And so I think that we have a real opportunity here to create a budget model that recognizes and embraces how important equity plays in that budget model. And I think the word shadow has given me a little bit of pause and hesitation. And I do think that part of what is trying to be done here allows us to create greater transparency and to minimize any impression of shadow budgets or shadow processes in terms of how you achieve the budgets that you're looking for. So I don't know if Stacy, you might have any other comments or feedback, or Elizabeth, you might. It is an area that we did talk about in kind of preparation for this session. And I think it's important to at least verbalize here that equity plays a role in something as significant as the development of and launch of a budget model.
Yeah, I think a better term might just be parallel. I mean, that's what's intended by it. What's intended by it from a financial management term is just that there would not be drastic reallocations to the campuses and schools and colleges while we're running the new model in parallel, right? You don't want to suddenly have massive, we're in the middle of a biennial budget. You don't want to suddenly be telling, the new chancellor of Pullman that she has to, lay off 15 faculty members suddenly in September, right? You want to make sure that you're making sure that the model is doing what you want it to do. And so it's a period of running our current budget process in parallel with the new process, and making sure that there are no unintended consequences before you have the model go live. So it's a trial year, if you will, that you make sure that as you move the model forward, don't just look historically at what happened in the past, but as you move the model forward, you make sure that the model is doing what you want it to do and that you have the governance systems in place. So, I take your point that shadow sounds shadowy, sounds shady, and we can use a different term, but it's intended to be out in the open and 100% transparent. It's not intended, it's just that it's not replacing the old budget quite yet until you're sure that you've worked out any of the systems that you need to work out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's another comment in there in terms of how budget requests have been made in the past as it relates to equity that has also been referred to almost as a shadow process, different than what you just described. And I am certainly in favor of much more transparency and the ability for all to achieve what they're looking for through a transparent and open budget process. And from what I understand, that's the goal of what we're trying to achieve here, which again centers our commitment to equity. So I think there's two different things that we're talking about here. I think we're talking about a parallel system. I also think there is a perhaps shadow practice that occurs in terms of how you achieve getting a request through a budget process when it's not nearly as detailed or as comprehensive as what you are working towards and have been doing for the last year or two. That's right. Which is what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions? And then I'll move us on to the next item. Okay. We have a housing and dining revenue bonds rate covenant to talk a little bit about. And again, Stacy is on deck for this, as well as our Associate Vice President for Finance, Matt Skinner.
Yes, and this is an information item where we inform the board that we do have a bonds rate covenant in some, I'm calling them older bonds. Over time, we have tried to move to a general revenue bond, which is basically guaranteed by the revenues of the universities. So you get better rates. But we have some bonds that could not be converted. They're not refundable. And in this case, we have a covenant on it that has, due to the COVID situation, we've crossed into an area where we need to follow the direction from those covenants and get a consultant's report to share to for the regents at a future meeting. Matt, I'll let you explain in a little bit more detail. I don't think we have to go too deep on this, as we're just literally following what it is that we need to do. And informing you of this, then we meet the covenants for the year, and then we have the report next year.
Yes, thanks, Stacy. Not nearly as exciting as the budget conversation, is it? But brief item, I think Stacy summarized it well. We have engaged an outside financial advisor who will review the housing and dining system. We anticipate their report will come to the Board of Regents in May. And by doing that, bring in the outside financial advisor, we meet our bond covenants for the year. So,
Any questions, comments? That might be right. Not nearly as exciting as our last topic. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving forward. The next agenda item is the academic year 2022-2023 tuition rates. I just want to say that I was thrilled to see that this is on our agenda for January. So as a new regent coming on board, it felt like, oh my gosh, like now all of a sudden we have an information item on tuition and then we have to vote at the very next meeting. And I needed a little bit more time to kind of warm up to something as significant and as impactful as tuition increases. And so I very much appreciate Stacy and Kirk putting this on the agenda to talk about in January, with the expectation that we move this through and we're at a place where everyone feels comfortable with voting in May. So with that, Stacy, please take it away with the budget, or the tuition proposal.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, Regent Shower. I think that my experience, especially because we've had so many new regents come on board, and then when I took over for the tuition discussions after Joan King retired, I did notice that. I said, we have this, it's kind of a flurry of activity toward the end. And I think, as I observed when new regents came and said, oh my goodness, this is such an impactful decision. So now that we've made the January board meeting, a regular regents meeting, I was hoping that we could have a discussion about how the process of approaching tuition rates. And in particular, I wanted to talk right now because we do have quite a few challenges around enrollments and around process. And so we'll go ahead and follow through on these slides. Kyle, go ahead and go to the next one. So I want to talk about tuition setting authority, which I know that you're familiar with, but it does kind of drive this process because of how it works, and then go over some of our current rates and how they've changed over time, and then just talk about what we're facing with both our enrollments and the impact that it is having on our budgets, and then some of the process that we have through our state appropriated budget that creates some of these challenges. And I'm hoping that this is a discussion, because this is an information item. In March, you will see a future action item on tuition, and then in May is when we act on those rates and finalize. So go ahead to the next slide. So this tuition setting authority does set the limit for our undergraduate resident rate increases. And you see the formula here. The challenge that we have is we don't usually get that number until April. And that's why you were seeing a March agenda item that didn't actually have rates in them, because we were, quote, waiting for that amount to come through. And now we're pretty understanding of about what that tends to be, about a 2.2 to 2.5% limitation. Then secondly, the regents can then set the rates for all other categories of students. So non-resident and graduate is really what we're talking about there. Go ahead. So this is how it's played out since that legislation came into effect. There was a maximum allowed increase, and then our increase. And the yellow highlights are just the 2 years that we came in under. And I will tell you, last year, we didn't know that it was going to be 2.8%, but we just estimated from the prior year. That's why we sought a 2.5% increase. Obviously, we needed the revenue, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but just to show you that we've kind of stayed aligned with what those are, and we've watched those rates since this legislation came into effect. Go ahead. But this is the craziness here. If you look at our resident undergraduate rates, I mean, how do families plan for this? You know, it goes really high. You see the recession period where the rate increases were quite large. Then they were zero. Then there was that period of, quote, tuition buyback by the legislature, then go down to 10%. And then in these last years, since 2017-18, you see where the legislation came into effect and kind of a standard rate of increase. But before that, I think it was, you know, pretty unpredictable, very reactive to what was going on, you know, in the economy and that type of thing. So the interesting thing, these two green lines, is where we are today with our resident undergraduate tuition rates, is that we are about at the level that we were in 2015 and 16. And I do remember some of those meetings when it was like, oh, this is, you know, these increases, they're just too high. And, you know, they may be or they may not be, but just to give you the perspective of where they are compared to where they have been. Next slide. Then we did the same for non-resident undergraduate rates. And again, these are under the Regents' control to approve. And for some years, they went to zero. Not really sure why. What we did here, though, was to say, well, let's just keep them going at the rate or propose the same rate for graduates and non-residents as for undergraduates. And you see a note here that non-resident undergraduate graduate tuition is about 25% of total tuition revenue. So most of that revenue is from undergraduate resident. Next slide. So this is resident graduate rate. Same thing, as it went way up and then it stayed zero. So these last 3 years, we've made those rate adjustments consistent with what the non-resident undergraduate rate, I'm sorry, resident undergraduate rate was. Next slide. A similar story here. Go ahead. So here's one of the challenges that we're facing, and it is you know, definitely related to the pandemic, is that our total undergraduate FTE as of our fall census for 21 is down. And we're seeing this trend both in, I'll show a slide later, it's certainly freshmen, but we also have, there's been a pretty significant decline in community college enrollment, which does impact and feed our transfer students. So that is in there, as well as we have two of our largest graduating classes, last May and the coming May. So what you see here is really the impact of all of that. And so when we look at the revenues, and now I'm thinking in terms of financial stability for the university, because our operating budget is about 49% state appropriation and about 51% tuition revenues. So this decline in enrollment is about a $25 to $27 million impact to WSU, pretty significant. And as you know, when COVID first hit, we were asked to reduce our budgets by 10%, our operating budgets by 10%. Then the state revenues weren't as bad as, you know, as they had initially indicated. But then in the next year, we were experiencing the enrollment decline. So the university imposed a 7.5% budget reduction. So the way we're filling this decline in tuition revenues is with that budget reduction. All of this, you know, this discussion we're having is contemplating things like our new budget model and where we need to make investments, but it's also contemplating the fact that, and you saw this in Phil's presentation on marketing and communications, is we just completed a fiscal recovery and then we went into COVID, and now we've got, you know, these enrollment challenges that's having a definite impact on our budget. Next slide. So when I talk about wanting to signal, you know, that it looks like we would request a 2.5% increase as a future action item at the March meeting, that is for these tuition rates: undergraduate, resident, non-resident, global campus, and non-resident, global campus, and then our graduates. And so that would show you what those rates would be. But really what I'm trying to balance is is when we look at what it is that we need to fund in fiscal year 23. So this is also very much tied to our, supplemental budget request for compensation. And in the governor's budget, as Colleen alluded to, the governor recommended a 3.25% salary increase. And that sounds great and everybody gets excited about it. But since about 2013, the state has taken greater interest in, the legislature, has taken greater interest in that tuition revenue portion, where they used to always fund all of the compensation increases recommended or approved by the legislature. They have started with starting in 2013 and 14 time period, what's called a fund shift. It's something that is common in many states. I don't think it was as common, it wasn't common in Washington before this. And what that is they look to the tuition revenue and they estimate, they say, well, you'll have this much more tuition revenue, and so you can fund half of that salary increase. And the problem that creates, and I'm just going to use the example of the governor's budget recommendation because it isn't finalized or approved, but there is some recognition because in that recommendation, it recommends covering about, 63% of the increase. What that still leaves though, is if we were to give all of our classified staff, professional staff, and faculty a 3.25% increase, it would require 4.3 million in new tuition revenue, which is about 2.5%. Now I'm talking about compensation, but there are other mandatory increases in there, like benefit rate changes and that type of thing. Again, state used to fund it, haven't been doing so. It's been about a 50% share. The problem with that is, of course, in a time with enrollment declines, that asking for a 2.5% increase really helps you just meet those costs, meet those mandatory costs. It doesn't give the additional revenue needed to start some of the programs to support students and the things that we would like to do with those tuition increases. And as Colleen indicated, there's recognition of this and discussion, but I think it's important for the Regents to understand that, because when we, if we ask for this and you're considering it, we're in a time period where it's just helping us stay even. The other example is in that 3.25%, it is required, mandatory, that the classified staff portion of that increase comes from the state appropriation. So without the tuition increase, that would leave about 1.6% salary increase for faculty and professional staff because they're not considered mandatory compensation increases. So I hope that's not confusing, but it's the dilemma we look at every year. And so when we ask for those tuition increases, it's so that we can try to make those compensation increases apply also to faculty and professional staff. We haven't really been able to do that in the prior years. So those increases, while classified staff do get what is approved, they've been like 1% and 1.5% for faculty and staff, and we put them into mid-year. So I think working with governmental relations to see if we can look at having more of that funded is a very positive thing. But meanwhile, it's just important for you to know that that's one of the difficulties that we face, because we're really, really wanting to give out those compensation increases in addition to have some funds for some of those strategic investments, but it's just really difficult in this situation. The next slide.
Just step in for just a quick second. I see Vice President Kerr just turned on her camera, and I wonder if you might have some legislative context to share. And I will also note that I suspect Chair Dickinson's going to want to move me along, given I only have 11 more minutes in this committee. But Vice President Kerr.
Sure. I was just turning it on in case you had any questions. I'll just say, with respect to the formula, so this goes back to the recession. And I think it's important for us to know that we advocated for some of these changes because the cuts were so drastic to higher ed, that in our conversations with the state, with the OFM and the legislature, it was a question of, how can we start to make some incremental progress back from these dramatic cuts? And so the fund shift, which is some of the language that we need to all be clear on, was one of those things. So it's all was many years ago, but going from 2010 to 2013, those were pretty dramatic shifts. The other thing is that we did have, for a very brief period of time, we had tuition flexibility. And then what happened in the state of Washington is, as tuition went up so much, the public put a lot of pressure on the legislature. So essentially they took it back. So we, and it's actually WSU led, we worked on an effort. So we now have a formula for tuition that is in statute. And so that's the number that Stacy talked about, which kind of goes between 2.3 and 2.5%. And that the legislature will authorize, if we can do that. And generally they say, yes, we can do that. And then we have discretion within that window. So that's a little bit of the background. Now, we still need to go back and then fix this formula that is broken. And I think there's appetite between the governor's office and the legislature to do that. It has just been part of the process of us coming out of the recession. The other thing I wanted to identify is that for all 6 of the 4-year institutions, setting aside the 2 years, how the formula impacts us is all very, very different. And that's another complicating factor. And so we bring this information forward for WSU, but the legislature looks at it from a sector perspective. And so what happens is that they would like to do, one solution, but when you look at every institution and how we are differently impacted with respect to enrollments and other types of funding, then it's hard to make an across the board solution. And so that's where Chris and I are starting to think through, well, what does it look like to do something that would be incremental? And so, as I said previously, this year, regardless of what we can do to solve the formula issue, we would like to work with the legislature and the governor's office so that we could at least be fully funded for this year as a way to kind of start to map us out of that situation. And I'm happy to take questions because there is a lot of legislative history here, and we have been very engaged with it over the past decade.
Chair Dickinson, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Mine is a little bit more around the narrative and I think, as we want to be really transparent and then also tread carefully around, we need to do, an increase, which I recognize and support and understand, tying it to ensuring, that we do comp increases, which for sure to our faculty and classified staff are worthy and it's necessary. Coming out of COVID, and I applaud our faculty for being back in person, and think that is a really positive thing, and think it's necessary that we continue that narrative, because I think as a parent who's paying tuition and is going to, perhaps get another increase, and if you're a parent that has a child that's a freshman, this is really actually almost a 10% increase from the time they started as freshmen to now, right? Because it's a cumulative increase over and over each year, that you're going to want to ensure that the quality of what their expectation of the education is, and I think they're all tied. That's tied together. And so, one, I applaud the faculty for being in person, but I also know as a parent, I want to make sure that that's going to continue, assuming that we're able to do that safely and appropriately, and knowing that, I'm not my child's not sitting behind a Zoom call with a professor that perhaps is, just rolled out of bed and sitting and, providing a course or an education that way. And I'm not suggesting that's happening at WSU. Certainly got a few employees myself that seem to have a hard time making that bridge some days. But I just I think the narrative is really, really important, how we position this.
Thank you. And I do agree with that. And I think that's why I really wanted to have the discussion. And even I see a lot of other institutions that will just signal, this is what you're going to pay over 4 years. You know, you're going to have this level of increase in this amount. And yet we're in this period, like you indicated, Regent Dickinson, where the educational experience has been different, you know, during the pandemic. And I think that you know, our students and many others are just very anxious to get back to, you know, all non-remote, in person and all of that. And so it does make it a dilemma, because if that experience isn't felt, it's hard to go through and say, oh, well, we need to increase tuition, you know, to cover these costs, not to enhance the experience. And that's not what any of us want to do. We want to enhance the experience. And so I think working on these challenges from multiple angles, as Colleen just indicated, can help us get there. But I also wanted to be honest that we're going to have a challenge coming up this year, because we're going to balance, you know, budget reductions with tuition, and how can we do it responsibly, as well as very, you know, transparently to say, yeah, this is what we're needing to do to keep moving ahead. And also it, you know, impacts how we think in the future about our budgets and where we need to focus our funds. So the one good piece of news I, you know, want to say is Washington does have the college grant program that guarantees financial assistance for our eligible undergraduate resident students, but those awards do vary based on income and family size. But yet that is a very generous program in the state of Washington that I don't really see elsewhere. So we're trying to think of all of the things that can both positively influence this, as well as help us get through this time period. I work quite a bit with Saichi, and I sit on some of his committees where we review this data extensively, and we talk about what investments do we need to make to get our students to WSU, but it is impacted by, you know, many different things, including community colleges and all of that.
Regent Ray, I see your hand is raised. I am hoping that we can ensure, because we are foreshadowing this as something that we will talk about at the next 2 Regent meetings, that we can spend some time. I think it's going to be difficult to divorce the legislative work that the governmental relations team is doing, especially as we look at the request for compensation increases, which will potentially impact this, that we look at a joint presentation with the finance and the tuition side, as well as the legislative context as well. So Regent Wright and Chair Dickinson, I know I have 3 more minutes and 2 more items. So go ahead, Regent Wright.
I'll be very brief because I know we're coming back to it. And we didn't quite get to it in your presentation with your slides. And I just wanted to comment that it appears that the students that will be most impacted by a 2.5% increase will be non-resident students, right? And those students do not have access to the funding that you're mentioning would help protect resident students from that increase. So I just identify those non-resident students as the most impacted, not only in terms of the actual cost, but then also in terms of not having access to that grant funding, being an out-of-state or an international student. And then secondly, that as we saw last meeting regarding knowledge of FAFSA, that we come in at like number 49th in the US in terms of student applications for FAFSA. So even though students may be eligible for some of those grants, there's still a disconnect between that. So I want to point those 2 things out, and I know we're running out of time. So
Colleen.
Yeah, Regent Shower, thank you. Regent Dickinson, just 1 second. Regent Wright, I appreciate you bringing that up. And that is exactly the issue that the legislature is looking at this year. And so when we talk about what we want to be advocating for, we want to advocate for WSU and what we've asked for, including compensation. I do think that the whole formula itself is probably beyond this supplemental session, but this issue of how we can identify funds so that students are not intimidated by the FAFSA is critically important, because the Washington grant that Stacy referred to, that is actually the most generous financial aid program in the country. So there are dollars that are available here in the state of Washington if we can find a path to help students get there. So I wanted to make sure that we knew that.
That's a great comment. Stacy, we weren't able to get through all your slides, and I really think that this is an important part of the work that we do in our role as regents. And so I'm glad that we were able to talk about it and that we have it on the agenda for the next meeting as well. There are a couple information items, and I would invite, if there are other comments or there are other questions, reach out to Stacy, to Colleen. I really want to encourage everyone to feel comfortable with what the cadence and pace for this tuition increase discussion is going to be over the next several months. I would also ask that we, by the time we get to the March meeting, that we have thought through that communications messaging. It's something that I think has been brought up more than once, that, you know, if we really are saying we're going to continue to do tuition increases every year, how do we create that transparency, and how do we help our students as a land grant mission to reduce those barriers and increase access to WSU. So
Shower, I just would thank you to Kirk and Stacy for giving us the opportunity to start socializing and having the conversation now versus doing it in the spring. We've kind of done it both ways, and it's uncomfortable, I think, for some of us who were new to the game on understanding it. So I appreciate the time. And I appreciate the coordination with Colleen as well. So thank you.
The two action items that you will see tomorrow in our Board of Regents meetings, the WSU Vancouver Life Science Building and the WSU Parking System Rates and Fines, were information items at our last board meeting. And so I want to ensure that I allow enough time if you have questions. This is not any new information. So my hope is you're ready to take action tomorrow in the board meeting. So with that, Stacy, both these items have your name on them. So anything that you feel like is important to share regarding those two items? And Regents, are there any questions you have before we enter into that space tomorrow where you'll be asked to take action?
They are the same as they were last time for the future action items. So it's really, if you've had time to absorb those and have questions about increasing the budget for the greenhouse on the Vancouver Life Sciences Building, and then the delegation of authority for a little bit higher increases on the parking and fine rates. And those are depicted as they were last time.
Regent Wright, you look like you might have a question.
I do. It's more of a
Okay.
comment
Okay.
or a question regarding the delegation of authority for parking rates. I'm just curious, one thing I appreciate about that authority remaining with the board is the amount of transparency that is guaranteed, essentially, for students on any campus to be aware of potential increases to parking rates. My concern with kind of delegating that authority is that these parking rates will be increased and students or student leaders may feel like they weren't given like enough heads up or had that process be as transparent as they would have liked. And so if this authority was delegated, do you have any thoughts on what like transparency might look like when those decisions are made away from the Board of Regents?
Yes, I do. And in fact, it was impactful in even making this request. First of all, just that the fact that the rates were based on CPI, which have been extremely low, and it does not enable us to do basic maintenance and repair on a lot of our parking. The second is there are multiple advisory groups that are very involved that do nothing but parking rates and fines, and they're a key part of this discussion. And they actually make the recommendation that then we take to the president, and then of course we would advertise those, and they have been so in the past. What this does is it just doesn't end up at the Regents meeting as often because of the very low CPI rates. But the communication processes that were in place before will continue to exist.
I would also say that we've tried to and emphasized during this whole particular portion of the meeting transparency and what we're doing and continuing to try and make sure that we're being held accountable. So I don't want this to be seen by anybody as sort of a backtrack that now parking rates poof are out there without the sort of dialogue that I think is characterized, at least, my time at WSU. So Shane, I think too, for future board meetings and things, if people feel that we are not handling that well, we can always make a change. But I think if you give us a year under this, we demonstrate that we still keep that level of communication and input as a large portion of the way we operate. Nobody wants to pay more for parking, so there's always going to be a negative part of that. But I do think we doing something other under the table, so to speak, is just not the way we've been trying to operate at all. And I don't see this being any change in that.
My apologies. I wasn't trying to say that you were doing this under the table. I think about the student regent role as an opportunity to bring information back to student leadership. And so if this is moving away from the Board of Regents, then I just am curious how student leaders, like where in the process they would be appraised of the situation, especially given that often our student leaders are in position for 1 year due to nature of graduating, right? And student leadership positions. So it wasn't an implication on your transparency, but on the nature of student leadership positions and that turnover.
And Regent Wright, we always appreciate your voice at this table, given your proximity to student leadership and understanding what's happening within the system. So thank you for leaning in and offering that perspective. Appreciate the clarification to President Schultz. I am gonna go ahead and close the committee meeting. I know we ran a little bit over. I think that we had a really good conversation about some significant aspects of what is moving forward. And I just wanna offer my thanks to Stacy. Not only implementing Workday is a huge effort that has gone really well, but these next elements with the budget plan and model is a next level for WSU. So thank you for your leadership here. And with that, Chair Dickinson, I think we can wrap up the Finance and Compliance Committee.
Thank you so much. Excellent job. No shortage of heavy, big topics to discuss here. And always count on Stacy for just making it lively. So thank you. Just the budget model discussion was outstanding. And again, appreciate the opportunity to start processing the concept around tuition and what that looks like in the spring. So, okay, we are going to take a break here for, give everybody, 5 minutes. We're going to come back at 4:20. And at 4:20, we will be convening into executive session. And this session will be a closed meeting. At this time, it is our intent that it will wrap up at 5 p.m. And so let's just all take a moment, just stand up again, move about. We have the executive session should move fairly efficiently. So let's just be back here and ready to go at 4:20 if you can, please. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. And for those who are not joining us for that, we will see you tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp, where we will begin our meeting. So thanks, everyone. Great day. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being so prompt. Just now that we have everyone back, we are formally going to be going into executive session. This will be to discuss with legal counsel performance of a public employee. The session will be closed. It will conclude at approximately 5 p.m. unless extended, and we will notify with further announcement on that. If any action is taken as a result of these discussions, it will be taken tomorrow during open session. Immediately following the executive session, the Board of Regents Committee meetings will adjourn. So you guys, at this time, you each are going to be moved into a breakout Zoom session. So Kyle, I'll turn it to you to make that happen. Okay, Kyle, am I live?
You are.
At this time, I would like to make an announcement that we are going to be extending the executive session for an additional 10 minutes. And I will return at the conclusion of that to close and conclude our Board of Regents meeting. Thank you. Okay, well, we are reconvening our Board of Regents meeting and have just wrapped up our executive session. And at this time, I am calling the close to our meeting. We will be back together again tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. And at this time,